All right, so thanks everyone for coming. You all know where you are. Third series, I guess, of the HR-in-a-Box series, and I am going to be talking to you today about enhanced performance management, how to integrate that process, and then key performance indicators a little bit as well. A little bit of an intro about me. So I'm an HR manager at North & Company Law Offices. We have about 75 employees spread around 11 different offices throughout Southern Alberta, and so performance management has been quite important in my role in the last few years. I'm a graduate of the Lethbridge College. I have a business administration diploma. I graduated in 2011. Then I went to the university and graduated in 2013. I have a management degree with a major in HR and labor relations. I obtained my CPHR last year, so 2017. And like I mentioned a little bit earlier, the reason why I'm here talking to you today is because I have implemented and I'm still kind of continuously improving the performance management process at our firm. So the main theme of today's talk is going to be competency-based performance management, and we're going to talk a little bit about what competency-based is. It just allows employers to identify core competencies that align with their mission, values, and goals. It's best used with employees whose performance isn't easily measured. So don't think about people who kind of produce widgets all day and you can kind of determine production. Think about those people, supervisors, their managers, people who need soft skills in their jobs. You might think of administrative positions as well for this type of performance management. This process allows organizations to align their employees with their strategic direction. And so it gives employees a sense of how they fit into the larger picture and how their success matters to the organization. And then we're going to talk about KPIs, so key performance indicators, a little bit. I am going to touch a little bit also on some technological changes or some trends in performance management, and then we have a brief case study that we're going to touch on at the end as well. So throughout the morning, I kind of saw people chatting at their tables, but what I would like you to do just before we start into definitely the case study is get to know what your review process looks like at your organization right now. So is it a yearly process? Are you meeting quarterly? Is it paper-based? Just talk amongst your tables about your review process. I'll give you a few minutes. All right. Thank you. I overheard some really good comments from some of the tables, and it sounds like you guys are definitely on the right track. So today, just some of our objectives that we're going to look at, like I mentioned kind of off the top. So we're going to know what performance management is. We're going to talk about what the process is, how the cycle can affect your process, some of the steps that should be taken. We're going to talk about how you should link employee performance with organizational goals, and that's sort of that integration process that we touched on earlier. And we're going to discuss some current issues of the review process, hopefully give you some tools to overcome them, and then talk about some best practices and trends that are happening, mostly related with technology. So first and foremost, what is performance management? It is a process, and that's important to remember throughout the entire presentation, that it's a continuous process. It's a process for managers and employees to work together to monitor and review employees' work objectives and their overall contribution to your organization. It's more than just an annual review. So the previous sort of school of thought was, if you don't hear from me, you're doing fine, but we'll touch base annual review time and we'll discuss your performance for the year. Not that that's a bad thing, at least you're touching base with your employees, but the purpose of this presentation is to turn the performance management side of things into more of a daily occurrence with your employees. It's about setting objectives, assessing performance, and providing ongoing coaching, and that's where that daily piece comes in, and providing feedback to ensure that employees are meeting their objectives and career goals and ultimately performing better for your organization so that your organization can meet their strategic plan. The goal of performance management, quite simply, is to promote and improve employee effectiveness. It sounds simple. Is to promote and improve employee effectiveness. So it's about, again, making that employee kind of the best that they can be, making them a high-performing employee so that eventually you can have a high-performing organization and they can see how they contribute to your success. So what does effective performance management look like? It's job specific, so you can't have the same plan for different people in different roles. You might have a different plan for someone in the same role depending on their level of service with your organization and depending on what their goals are. If they're just starting out and they're overly ambitious and want to progress, they'll have a different performance management plan than someone who's nearing retirement. It should align with your organization's strategic direction and culture. I did read a study that showed that only 65% of organizations have an agreed upon strategy. So before you dive into more of a formal performance management plan, you should have an agreed upon strategy with your organization, where you want to go, how you're going to get there, what tools do you need to get there, so you can set that same plan for your employees. It should provide an accurate depiction of performance, and we'll touch on some ways that you can get an accurate depiction a little bit later. It's a collaborative process. It includes goal setting on the employee's part, it includes feedback on your part, and two-way communication is important for that collaboration. You should monitor and measure results and objectives. Don't just set that employee free and have them perform as they will. You should have a process for monitoring and checking in with that employee. It should include both constructive and positive feedback. We're going to talk a little bit today about some of the generational differences we're seeing in the workplace. Younger workers want that positive feedback. It's not, like I said, that previous mentality where if you don't hear from me, you're doing fine. They want to know that they're doing fine. And giving that constructive feedback as well. I'm going to give you some tips on how to give it effectively and hopefully make it a little bit easier to give. It's not everyone's favorite thing to be constructive. It should provide some training and development. Again, those are the tools that you need to get to your goal, to meet your objective, and to hopefully have a high-performing employee. You should establish clear communication and discuss with that employee what the best way for that is. Sometimes it's email, sometimes it's meeting face-to-face. We're going to touch on a little bit of that a little bit later. And identifying and recognizing accomplishments. Again, that comes back to the communication piece. So younger employees, as they come into the workforce, they want to know that they're doing well. They want to be recognized for the work that they're doing, and so it's important to recognize that. And then again, identifying areas of poor performance and establishing plans for improvement. Hopefully not all of your performance management plans end in dismissal, but we all know that a performance management plan can be useful if you were thinking about that. So, summary about what the performance management cycle things with that. Second step is to monitor, and then the last evaluate. And this is kind of the process throughout my presentation. Oh, yep. Step one is to plan. So you want to review the employee's job description to determine if it's accurately reflecting the work that they're doing. This is especially important if maybe to their role, you're adding some competencies, and we'll touch on that a little bit. And it's also important if they're not job description. And you want to make sure that they understand what their job description is. Again, that helps the processing and the reviewing and evaluating a little bit later. So after you review the employee's job description and you make sure that it's up to date, you want to review the links that you have between the job description and your strategic plan. You want to make sure that their work plan and the organizational goals are integrated. So again, if some of your strategic plan is to grow your organization, you want to make sure that that employee is performing at a higher and higher level to help you grow, whatever that might mean to your organization. And then you want to identify how those results are going to be measured, and that's where we'll get into the KPI, or key performance indicators. I recommend like 3 to 5. They don't need a ton of KPI. These are critical aspects of the job that need to be measured in order to determine success. So they're choice areas that should be determined by the organization's strategic plan. And again, that's where it's important to have a strategic plan. And by the employee's desire to improve outcomes in a certain part of their job, or by the need to emphasize a particular aspect of their job. And again, these are critical aspects. So if they are not met, their performance is deemed as unsatisfactory. This stuff can get a little dry, so I thought I would throw at least one comic in. It's Dilbert. Sorry, not Dexter. Dilbert. And he's getting a little check-in from his manager. It looks like his manager hasn't told him about his objectives. He's asking how they're doing. I mean, obviously you have to lie and say you're nailing them. All right, so continuing on to step 1. So you have to agree on a monitoring process. So whether that's We talked about some paper-based reporting that you might do. Maybe you have some electronic reporting that you might do for that employee. But it's important that your employees know what to expect from you and when to expect it. And make sure they understand how they're receiving that reporting or that check-in, and to make sure that they understand the information that's given to them. I think it's pretty important to go over those reports with people. They should understand how they're being measured. And then you should review the competencies. So I touched on a little bit at the beginning that this is mostly a competency-based performance process. Competencies are the observable behaviors of top performers, and it's not just what they do, but how they do it, how they get to be a top performer. And it's especially important when assessing employees whose performance is harder to quantify. So again, not just those people who are producing widgets or you can determine production, but perhaps those people's supervisors or managers, someone in an administrative role, anything like that. You should also identify training opportunities to help that employee grow their skills. That's important, especially, again, in the multi-generational workforce, which we'll touch on a little bit later. And then documenting the plan. Seems basic, but you don't remember what you said 3, 6, 9, 12 months ago, so it's just really important to document that plan and any communications that you had during that meeting. This is just an example of one of my competencies I have in my review, so it's planning and organizing. And the reason why this is important to my firm is because we want to be a proactive player in the law market. We don't want to be reactive, so it's important for people in a managerial setting to plan and to organize and to just be proactive. So this is just a really quick example. It defines what planning and organizing means to the organization. There's some examples there at the bottom. There's room for comments. And then there's just a 5-point rating scale on the side there. Okay, so talking about KPIs a little bit. KPIs are intrinsically linked to the firm's strategic goals, and we touched on that a couple times. You're going to hear that a lot. And it's important. It's an important indicator of current performance levels of an individual, a department, or the company achieving the goals. So one example, if you were a salesperson, for example, one of your KPIs might be to look at new revenue. It might be to look at total revenue, and it might be to look at your average sales size. For someone in HR or a people management role, it might be to look at your employee engagement rating. It might be to look at your employee turnover. It might be to look at how long it took you to fill any open positions you had. Just any sort of measure of performance that you would consider critical to your position. So there's 2 types of indicators that you can use when developing a KPI. They're called leading and lagging indicators. So the first one, lagging, it's an indicator that tells you how you have performed in the past. So think of like a financial report. That was your financial information for the year prior, but it's not necessarily an indicator of anything going forward. Then there's the leading indicator, which is to offer guidance for future results. So if you think about an employee engagement survey, it might be likely to forecast production in the future. It might be likely to predict customer satisfaction in the future. You can use some of those indicators to determine future success. A properly developed KPI should integrate with regular reviews. You should be checking in with employees. It should be easy to measure, easy to understand. And managers and other stakeholders should be assessing the meaning of the results. So it's not just enough to show them, okay, you've met 57% of this goal. Show them why it's important and show them why it's critical to organizational success. And then again, I'll say it 100 times today, you should make sure that your KPI is aligning with the goals of either the department or the organization. And that being said, KPIs can be implemented at different levels. So you could have an individual KPI, department KPI, organizational KPI. They can all integrate or they can be completely separate, and it's just a way to determine success. All right, so still continuing on to step 1, which is plan. This is just a very quick and simple way about how to set good goals or good objectives. I think SMART's fairly widely known. This is what I use with my employees. It seems to be the easiest to grasp and understand. The other little key point I have here is a little formula. So if you take your action verb, you add the object of the action verb, and then your measure, you should be able to come up with a pretty decent goal. So what is SMART? SMART is a specific goal, a measurable goal, it's an attainable goal, it's realistic, and it's time-bound or time-limited. So this means you know what is to be done, how much, or how often, or how many, or at what cost. You should know that it's attainable, it's in a reasonable path for that employee. It's realistic, so it's matching the level of complexity that your employee operates at. And it matches their experience, their capabilities, and knowing that there's no insurmountable forces outside of their control that would limit them from meeting that goal. And then it's time-bound, and this is one that might get missed. You have to be clear on the time frame. So the most common time frame would be for whatever your review period is. It's easy to check in at the end of that review period. And so it's just important to have a deadline on that. So an example of a not SMART goal would simply be, I want to grow my business. It's a good goal. Everyone wants to grow their business and be successful, but it's not a SMART goal. I don't know how we would measure our success if that was our goal. So a SMART goal would be, I want to acquire 3 new clients for the consulting side of my business. Within 2 months, I'm going to do this by asking for referrals, launching social media campaigns, and networking with local businesses. This will allow me to grow my business and increase my revenue. Okay, so to wrap up step 1, we're just going to talk about some best practices, and we've touched on these a little bit before. So first and foremost, have both the employee and the manager or supervisor sign off on the work plan. This seems pretty basic, but that work plan becomes extremely valuable in times when that employee isn't performing to your standards. So it can be used in a performance management plan or a PIP. It can be used for termination discussions later down the road, focusing on the positives for this presentation. It can also be used to create some accountability to that employee if they've signed their name on that line, indicating that that's how they're going to perform. So some other ways to create accountability, very simply, is to return and report, create a formal process, and have consequences. For return and report, there's 2 different ways you can do it. So either the manager or the supervisor can return to that employee and report on their progress, or you can flip it and have the employee return to the manager at a given date to determine their progress as well. I'm going to touch on that one again at the end when we talk about some of the changes and trends in performance management. Create a formal process. So make sure that the employee is clear about how everything is going to look. If you do a yearly assessment, you want to make sure on January 1 you have to have your plan ready. This is when we're going to check in. This is going to be your second check-in. This is when we're going to wrap up and review at the end of the year. It's important that they know what is expected of them and when, so they can accurately meet their goals and create the new ones for the next year. And then consequences. So that seems pretty hard-handed, but there should be some consequences if performance isn't matching your expectations. It could be something as little as having a performance management meeting if things aren't going the way of the organization. It could be showing what monetary gain could have happened had they been a high performer. Ultimately there is the PIP, like I said, the performance improvement plan. But I think a lot of times just showing those little consequences along the way and showing them what could happen if they were a high performer or a solid contributing employee is enough to kind of motivate them to meet their goals. Any questions on step 1? Nothing? Okay. Moving on to step 2. So step 2 is monitor. So you should be continuously monitoring performance. Like I said, this isn't the previous thought where you just kind of let them run for the entire review period and check in with them a year later and see how they're doing. You should be continuously monitoring their performance, but not micromanaging their tasks. So to be effective, the performance management system must be continuously monitored, and then focus the attention on results achieved, not individual tasks that they're doing. You want to stay away from that micromanaging. You should also focus on individual behaviors and team dynamics that might be affecting the work environment if your individual performance is integrated with your organizational goal. So during this phase, the employee and the manager should meet regularly. Regularly means whatever it means to your organization. If that's monthly, that's great. If it's weekly, that's great. It obviously shouldn't create more work, but it should be often enough to still be effective without being a burden of time. So you should assess progress towards meeting performance objectives, let them know where they're standing on any goals that they've set. You should share feedback on progress related to the goals, and you would get this by obtaining it from their reports. Identify any changes that might be required to the work plan. So if there was a shift in your organizational direction, if the organization had a poor year and you're changing your standards of performance, if anything changed in your organization, it's important to communicate that back to the employee, because now their performance is tied, the performance of the organization is tied to their performance as an individual. And then you want to determine if there's any extra support that's needed. So if they set a goal and they realized a couple months in, I don't have the training to get to this goal, I need a piece of software, or I need to attend a course or anything like that, you should be determining any extra support and course correcting along the way. That's the point of meeting more frequently than yearly. All right, so to touch on coaching a little bit, coaching isn't necessarily it's a good thing. It's completely positive. So you should be coaching to address concerns and issues related to performance, but it should be a positive contribution for that employee. So coaching is providing direction, it's providing guidance, and providing support. And as a coach, managers need to recognize the strengths and weaknesses of that employee and work with that employee to boost their strengths and work on their weaknesses, and identify opportunities to maximize those strengths and, again, limit the weaknesses, improve those weak areas. So it's very much when you consider like a youth basketball coach, like you're working with those kids, you're working with them every day, you're giving them feedback. It's not necessarily a hard-handed performance conversation at that point. It's helping them, it's positive, it's motivating them. All right, so we're going to talk on constructive feedback a little bit. So constructive feedback is meant to be concise. It's meant to focus on particular issues, so it should be specific. It should never be personal. It should always focus on, it should always be intended to help that employee, and that's kind of where that coaching comes in as well. It should be used to enhance skill development. It should be forward-looking or planning for the future. And it should be focused on fact and observation and directed towards those behaviors that aren't necessarily changeable. All right, so when providing feedback, this is kind of the process that I like to use day to day. It's a good method for on-the-spot feedback. It's not necessarily something you would wait for a formal review meeting or a formal review period. And one just little piece of advice I have is you don't have to be nice, but you have to be direct. So you're not their friends. You have to be polite and respectful, but you don't have to be nice. So be as direct as you can, be as specific as you can. I promise if you do it right, people will take it pretty well. I think if you have a good employee who's wanting to work on their performance. So the feedback model that I follow is facts, reaction, impact, and request. So what this would look like is in the facts section, you would describe their behavior and let them know what they said or what they did. In the reaction section, you would focus on feelings, because that it just internalizes it a little bit more for the employee. So, for example, when you did this thing, I felt like this, or I felt this happened. Then to talk about the impact, and again, this kind of goes back to that integration piece, is you want to tell them what the impact was on your organization, on the department, on someone else's performance. And then you have a request at the end. So you would ask them, what can we do to resolve this? How can we make sure this won't happen again? What can you tell me about why this happened? Anything like that. So it's a good way to plan your conversations ahead of time if you're having a difficult conversation with an employee surrounded, based on some behaviors that they might have expressed. So again, sticking to the facts, sticking to the reaction or the feelings that you might have had, describing the impact on the organization, on the department, on other people, and then having a request for more information. So some best practices on, I'm sorry, I forgot to change the slide. This is the slide for feedback. So some best practices on step 2, which is monitoring. So you want to prepare and think it through. It's a little bit of an investment ahead of time to think about these kind of things, but before you sit down with an employee, you should have the big picture. You don't want to mix any facts up with any other employee or anything like that. So confirm the facts of the performance issue and make sure you know it and can describe it and can tell them how to fix it. So that might come down to having someone else in the meeting who might know that process a little bit better. It might just mean preparing it or learning it yourself if you're having a conversation like that. But just thinking it through and knowing what you want to say. You want to be clear about what the issue is, and that kind of goes back to that direct feedback. You want to give them as clear and concise feedback as possible. You want to be clear about what the consequences are. So this is a check-in point. You should be letting them know if this behavior continues to happen, assuming it's negative, these are the things that might happen to you, whether that's going on a PIP, having additional performance management meetings. It might even be, like I said, showing them the monetary consequences for not performing. You want to plan to meet regularly. Like I said, regularly is defined by whatever works for your organization, works for your department. And you want to meet in a location that's private and that it's a neutral location. I find if supervisors in our organization meet in their offices, there's always a little bit of tense air because you're kind of meeting on someone's turf, right? So just meeting in a neutral location, making sure it's private so that there's not a risk of being interrupted. That's always important because you want to be respectful at the same time when you're giving employees some difficult feedback. And then you want to be calm and approach the issue with objectivity and clarity. I like to kind of just write the key points that I'm going to talk to my staff about if I'm having a meeting like this. I don't necessarily use it as a script, but I can use it to kind of hone the conversation back into the key points that I brought them in for, so I can be clear, concise, and objective about that information. Any questions on step 2? So step 3 is review and evaluate. So you should meet to review, summarize, and highlight the employee's performance over the course of the review period. And again, the review period is kind of whatever works for you guys. If you're meeting quarterly or biannually or annually. I think it's important to include a self-assessment. I know it's hard to kind of put that mirror back on yourself and review yourself in that way, and it can be a little bit awkward. And I think there's a misconception that employees are likely to grade themselves a little bit higher. I find that, again, your high-performing and high-engaged people won't do that because they want to have an accurate depiction of their performance. So it's standard in most appraisals to have a self-assessment. And I think it's important to use the self-assessment as a guide to identify any gaps between what the employee thinks they're doing and what the manager says they're doing. So you should be identifying these gaps and determining a plan to how to correct them. I also encourage employees to track projects throughout the year. So some of our staff, not everyone does this, but you can, again, you can tell kind of the high engaged or high performing employees that we have. They keep track of their projects throughout the year, and so that when we meet, they can use it as examples for their success or for maybe some gaps or areas that they can improve upon too. So I think it's important to track your projects. The employee should be recording their goals on their own. So I give a copy of their goals at the end of the performance meeting to them so that they have it in front of them every day or however often they look at it. These are what my goals are. This is where I'm at in terms of success, and this is what I can do to keep progressing. And then I encourage them to seek educational opportunities that might relate to any of the goals that they've set or to their performance. I actually require Sorry, I think this slide's out of date. I actually require employees to bring at least one training opportunity to me at their review time. So that might even be, going to a lunch and learn or attending a word course or going to a week-long conference on this topic. But as long as it just shows a little bit of engagement when they're looking at that kind of stuff, they're looking at how it relates to their goals and they're looking at how it relates to the organization. And the last point on this slide is no surprises. So if there was nothing discussed throughout the year with that employee, it doesn't go on the year-end review or the end of the review period. It should, in fact, be a review of their performance. No new information should be on it. Okay, so continuing on with review. You should be making notes between conversations. And if you're not the one that's always giving feedback to employees, or if your employees report to more than one manager or supervisor, it's important to have those people also keep notes, because they could be having conversations without relaying it to the whoever needs to know, whoever collates that information. So we at North & Company, we have a shared drive that's private to employees, but supervisors and managers can see it. And each employee just has a Word document. And so if Joe talks to Sally about something, Joe can put it in this Word document so that when the direct supervisor is looking at it, they know that Joe had that conversation and that Sally was made aware of that information. Communicate organizational standards and competencies. And again, that's important to do if they've changed, whether that's for the better or for the worse, or if they're new, if this is a new process you're implementing. The only thing I can really touch on enough today is just communication back to that employee. That's the real key to integrating the process. And then you want to gather feedback from multiple sources, and we're going to talk about a 360-degree review in a minute. You want to ensure employees have a well-defined and up-to-date job description. And we talked about that right in step 1. It's impossible for them to perform to your standards if they don't know what they're doing. And then last but not least, you want to invest in yourself. Become a better manager, become a better coach, become a better supervisor. That might be in-house training and learning your industry a little bit more. That might be attending things like this and kind of getting information on the softer side of things or the HR side of things. But it's important to invest in yourself. If you're the one that's helping coach these employees along, it's important that that you're keeping your skills sharp as well. All right, so you also want to summarize their accomplishments, and I think I touched on this right at the beginning as well. With this multi-generational workforce that we're seeing, it's becoming more and more important to communicate things back to the employees, and that doesn't always mean the bad things. Let them know when they're doing a good job, let them know when they've accomplished something great, and let them know the impact that it had on the organization. Document gaps and challenges, and identify areas for training and development. We touched on that in the previous slide. So some gaps could be what their self-perceptions are and what the manager said they were doing. They might identify some gaps. This is where I want to be performing and this is the level I'm at. And then it's not enough just to identify them. You want to make a plan to how to close those gaps. And talk about the future with the employee. This might mean you're coaching them into retirement, and so you should be looking at succession planning. Lucky that there's a session later today on succession planning. It might even mean they want to switch departments, but you don't want to move an underperforming employee until, you don't want to move them until they've met a certain level of expectations. But you want to talk about the future with that employee. You want to try to minimize the risk that they might leave for a competitor for a better future or a future that they see themselves in. And then you want to sign off and have the employee keep a copy. And again, this seems very simple, but that document can be gold if you're having performance issues in the future. And so you want to make sure that they have a copy, they know what was discussed, and that they're signing off on it. So some best practices for step 3, which is review and evaluate. So one, it's schedule it. There's nothing more anxiety-inducing than your manager coming up to your desk at 3:30 and saying, get into the conference room, we're having a performance meeting and HR is coming. So just make sure it's scheduled so that employee can prepare as well. It'll just be more useful for each side. And again, you want to prepare for it. Don't go in blind, don't go in without refreshing what you talked about last year. Think about what successes they might have had this year. Make sure those are communicated. Make sure you acknowledge any barriers that they might have had over the year and communicate those as well. And then make sure you're planning some of the feedback that you're going to give to them. You should always have a future focus. Again, that kind of focus on growth, focus on high performing, and focus on the employee's future. And you should always close with action plans and goals and a plan to meet again. That doesn't have to be in a week. It could be at the end of the review period, but it's really important to always plan to meet again. Let them know, thank you for your goals. This is what you did this year. This is what we see next year. We're going to meet again around this time, and we'll check in at that time, just so they can be prepared. So looking at any questions on step 3? or steps 1 or 2? Okay. So looking at some current issues of the review process. So I have a couple different biases that are listed here. These are the ones that I see most frequently. These by all means are not all of them. The first one is the halo or the horn effect. So if you don't know, the halo effect is when the person being evaluated has one positive attribute, and so the evaluator is marking them perhaps more fairly than they might have deserved otherwise. And then the horn effect is the exact opposite. So they might have a negative attribute, and so they're being evaluated a little bit lower than they might deserve. Central tendency is the tendency for raters to evaluate most of their employees as average. They do this to try to avoid favoritism by giving them high marks, or to avoid having to give them an increase in their wage, or to avoid conflict by giving them a lower mark. Then there's strictness and leniency. So you're either too strict, too hard on your employees, or too lenient. There's the recency effect. So the rater focuses on what happened lately versus what happened over the entire review period. This one I find is probably the most prevalent in my experience. And then there's the similar to me bias. So it's a more than fair rating for someone who is very similar to me, might have the same background, might have the same education, might be in a similar position, but I would be rating that person more than what they might deserve. So some tools to try to overcome these. There's 3 that I'm going to quickly touch on. We talked about self-assessments a little bit already. So that's kind of determining where the employee thinks that they're performing with any gaps that the manager says they might have. So looking at that, identifying those gaps, figuring out where they might be coming from, whether it's an actual performance issue or if it's just a misperception. Then there's calibration. So I won't get into this one in great detail, but the basic premise of calibration is when you have multiple managers reviewing a certain employee, discussing their performance, discussing any achievements or any issues they might have, and then agreeing on a performance appraisal rating. So they would typically come up with a standard or a solid performer, and then mark anyone kind of above or below that. So this would just allow multiple people who have witnessed that employee's performance to have a say in how they're being appraised. And then there's the 360-degree feedback. So we touched on this one a little bit already, but it's just kind of assessing, getting multiple people involved in the review process. These don't have to be managers or direct supervisors. It could be your front desk reception if they have a lot to do with that person. It could be their assistant. It could be someone in accounting. Anyone who's trained them, even anyone who has been impacted by their performance or lack of, or anyone who has a kind of a card in the game. So like I said, a trainer or a manager or things like that. So just getting the feedback from all of those people and determining, again, where some of the gaps are. But they should give you a better idea of performance. So if there's a personality conflict or anything like that, that would hopefully be eliminated with the 360. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about technology, not at all my strong suit. I have a very paper-based program, so I had to do some research for this, but it was fun. So there are some, I would just say some trends that have been happening recently in the performance management side of things, and then subsequent software or tools on how to deal with them. So we're just going to touch on 3. So one is that yearly reviews or traditional reviews are falling out of favor, and that's where I talked about, you let the employee know how they did last year, and then you don't talk to them again till the end of that year, and kind of keep that same system going and don't check in. So organizations are realizing more and more that you have to increase communication and interaction with your employees in order to heighten their productivity and their performance. Again, you want to make sure that they're high performing, so you as business owners can be high performing as well. It also reduces turnover. The more communication you can give that person, if they're left adrift, they're left to wonder. You may want to introduce one-on-one check-ins with staff and give them real-time feedback, and that's hard to do in some organizations, but there's some tools a little bit later on that can give you some help there. So an example of this would be Microsoft. So Microsoft got rid of annual appraisals and performance ratings. Managers only meet now to discuss salary or any performance issues that they might have. So they only discuss reward or potential implementation of a performance improvement plan or termination. Otherwise, managers and employees just kind of meet as things happen. They have one-on-one check-ins, but there's nothing formal in place. So it's a little bit of an extreme, actually eliminating the performance management thing altogether. And I say it's extreme, but 50% of HR or people managers have eliminated or are planning on eliminating the traditional performance review process. My recommendation would be not to. I think it's extremely risky. You might just want to implement something else, something a little bit more agile to help those employees. So Deloitte is one who has also eliminated their performance review as it was historically known. Again, sort of that annual review, you're not checking in at any time in between. What they do now is they ask their supervisors 4 questions. So question 1 is, given what I know about this person's performance, and if it was my own money, I would award this person the highest possible compensation increase and a bonus. And so they would just say, extremely, not extremely likely, not likely, neutral. They would mark that. Question number 2 is, given what I know of this person's performance, I would always want him or her on my team. And again, they would grade it on a 5-point scale. Question number 3 is, this person is at risk for low performance in the future. And again, that scale. And question number 4 is, this person is ready for a promotion today. So those are the 4 questions Deloitte asks all their managers during their review period, and that's the only thing that they base performance on. So again, I wouldn't recommend eliminating performance reviews altogether, but you might just want to find kind of a happy medium between increasing communication, but still having those check-ins with people, so you can keep the good people, hopefully the bad people we can work with. Trend number 2 is that professional development is becoming more important than performance management. So millennials will constitute nearly 50% of the workforce by 2020. That's a big number, and that's in 2 years. So we need to be mindful of their motivations. The answer for this is in training, it's in development, it's in improving them as an employee, and it's making the most valuable benefit that employers can provide. So they want to know how their professional growth is helping the organization. And again, that's kind of the integration piece we've been talking about a little bit. And in a survey I read, it said that 80% of millennials state that professional or career growth is a critical aspect of what they look for in a job, and it's what they look for if they're leaving their current position. So it's really important to make sure that professional and career growth is at top of mind when you're looking at recruiting, hiring, or retaining millennials. So an example of this is Yelp. So that's kind of the crowd restaurant grading app. So they realized that their young executives were getting poached by a competitor. And, they conducted their exit interviews, they did some research, and they found out it was because those people felt like they weren't allowed to grow in that organization. So they took some time, they made a plan, and they completely changed their culture so that every single day people were learning something new. That was just a thing they did with their organization. There was something new every single day to keep these millennials engaged, to keep them interested in learning, and ultimately making that organization higher performing. All right, so the last one we're going to touch on today in terms of trends is employee autonomy. So employee autonomy is, I think, becoming more critical, again, with that generational shift in the workplace. And people want to be left to their own devices to perform in the way they see fit. This does not mean not intervening. This is where coaching would come into play, not necessarily micromanaging. So they want their managers to coach and support rather than micromanage. So just giving them the autonomy that they need to do their job. This just gives them a chance to kind of be in the driver's seat and gives them greater control over their goals, their personal development, their career, and potentially even their hours. So I think it's important to look at your organization and see how flexible you can be with some of these things. Again, as we see that multi-generational shift, in order to attract and retain those millennial employees. I'm going to use Deloitte again as an example. Deloitte makes the employees responsible for arranging their own check-ins with their manager. So this puts them in the driver's seat. They can check in as often as they want. And the burden is then released from the managers to make sure that that happens. So you know that your high engaged, high performing employees are probably doing that on a regular basis, and you can determine if your lower performing employees are doing it as well. All right, so there's a ton of new software out there. Like I said, we have a fairly paper-based system at North & Company, so that's what I'm definitely familiar with. I try to automate it as much as I can, linking spreadsheets and things like that. But there is software out there that makes this really easy. I watched tutorials on both 7 Geese and Bamboo HR in prep for this. They look like amazing programs. They can be decently inexpensive depending on the size of your organization. They're all subscription-based services as well. So you renew on a monthly or a yearly basis. So if you decide that it's not working for you, you're not, you haven't paid for the software or any licenses ahead of time, which is nice. So the trend in technology, it's leaning towards being more agile. Like I said, not waiting for that year to be over before you're discussing performance management with your employees. It's increasing that continuous feedback. It's providing that coaching and providing that mentoring in order for them to be high performing. And so some of this software can do that for you. When I didn't watch Clearview, but it came up a couple times in some articles, so I recommend looking at that one as well. When I had the 7 Geese and the Bamboo HR tutorials, the little guides that they sent out, it was kind of neat because when you log into the employee dashboard, it gave them just a little quick chart, like here are your goals, so it would just require some inputting on the manager's part. It showed them kind of a progress bar. This is where you're at in terms of meeting your goal, and then it showed them how they contributed to organizational success. So I've talked about that a couple times throughout the presentation, but this was really clear. You performed at over 100% of this goal. This is how that affected the organization. And so it just requires, again, a little bit of input on the manager or the supervisor's part at the beginning of every review period, and then inputting that whatever information is needed for those KPIs. But it really just hit home, I think, how integrated that process could be and how the impact of having a high-performing or a high-engaged employee has on the organization. It also, the Bamboo one was kind of neat too because it allowed employees to request feedback. So they would just email whoever the account holder is. They said it's typically someone in the HR department. And then the employee would say, I'd like to check in on my goals. It's another couple months till my review. And then that person could just send out a standard email through Bamboo HR. And obtain all the information that they needed from those people's supervisors. So it was all done in the system. It's a web-based app, and then it was all compiled. And Bamboo actually had, this is the part I really liked, it had the option to have someone moderate the comments. So if you have people in your organization who don't always maybe use tact or anything like that, this gave the opportunity to have someone in the organization just review it and make sure it was appropriate for employees' eyes. That was kind of neat. So if there's no questions on anything I talked about today, hopefully I didn't blow through it too fast, we're going to go into the case study. So the case study is you're a manager. You're a manager, and so you're going to do a review of an employee that you have. So our fictitious employee's name is Jane. She's a 42-year-old supervisor at a mid-sized organization with 5 direct reports. She's been in the role for 2 years and with the organization for 8. Jane's company updated its performance management process in 2017, so this is the first full cycle of the new system. In the past, she was always given glowing reviews. Her boss always said she walks on water, but she's frequently late for work. Jane's boss, Rita, is approaching retirement in the next 3 to 5 years and would like Jane to take over her position. But Jane's peers aren't so sure that she's cut out for the job. Jane's keenly aware of her team members' performance and takes pride in coaching them throughout the year. She schedules time to review and monitor their performance and meets with them regularly. She often comments on how she misses being a salesperson but enjoys the challenge of her supervisory role. Jane's organization took a financial hit in 2016 and lost 2 team members in their sales department. The organization has communicated to Jane that they would like to focus on sales growth while keeping an eye on expenses. Jane set all of her objectives to align with the organization's competencies that were provided, as well as what she indicated would benefit the organization. She's eager to prove herself. 3 out of 5 of Jane's direct reports indicate that she's a solid supervisor but can be overbearing and sometimes interferes on files or with clients. These same 3 reports have asked for additional training over the course of the year but have yet to receive it. 2 of the 5 appreciate the help that she provides and say that she has met or exceeded their objectives because of Jane. 4 out of 5 of Jane's direct reports are meeting all or most of their objectives. Jane has given all of her direct reports a rating of 3, which is solid contributor or higher, and company policy indicates that level 4s and 5s will get a merit increase. So 2017 has been a year of growth for the organization. They have increased their sales by 27% and have increased their sales staff by 2 FTE. An opportunity came up and they're looking at expanding their premises to align with their growth model. Jane is struggling to keep up with her coaching and mentoring obligations given the increase in personnel. She has found time to attend a leadership seminar over the course of the year, which consisted of 6 2-hour sessions based on effective leadership coaching, mentoring, and performance management. So your mission is to use the performance plan attached and develop some tips to have a chat with Jane, given this is the first year that she's had an effective review, and then develop some goals you'd like to see for Jane. So you can do this at your tables. There's an even number or a similar number at each table. So do this as a group. It's a pretty basic form. Obviously, we don't have a ton of time today to get into anything too specific, but just use the form provided and use the objectives, that Jane has set to determine her performance. Maybe have her set some SMART goals for the next year, and we'll give you some time to do that. Okay, it sounds like everyone's almost done. So why don't I start with this group right here at the front. Do you want to have a representative just kind of... Oh, okay, sure. Yeah. Do we have a rep? Okay. So why don't you let us know how you graded Jane and kind of what goals you set?
All right, so looking overall, we were kind of on the fence between occasionally meets expectations and solid contributor, so really we would love to rate her a 2.5. And just for goals, like the training was definitely one big aspect. Like there were 3 staff that expressed interest in training programs and they didn't get it. Even though Jane herself got training, and so that was definitely one goal. You need to focus on your current staff and get them trained, and so that they'll be maybe more satisfied with their position. And then another one that we were talking about was the financial aspect, like all the sales goals and the growth. Like she didn't meet her sales growth goal for the year, was shy of 3%. However, she did increase her staff by more than the goal, and so maybe that's why the sales kind of failed, is maybe she was focusing too much on the new employees and was too overwhelmed with that aspect that she couldn't focus on the sales. But yeah, that's kind of our summary.
Good, thank you. So yeah, first look at Jane. She's pretty complicated. Her performance is pretty complicated. What about this group here? Do we have a rep for this group? Okay, perfect.
I don't know if I need the mic. Pretty loud. Fair enough. Overall, I think we kind of came to the conclusion of probably an exceeds. There's certain objectives where we feel she's a solid contributor, and there's lots more questions that obviously you would want to ask. Number one is, if I'll just even want to go on it through a kind of a case-by-case thing. Financial performance seems to speak to itself. The company's doing quite well. The only question we posed at this table was, is that a result of the organizational shift in one direction and she kind of was along for the ride, or was this as a result of her performance specifically? Staff support, when you've got staff that can identify areas where they want to improve and where they feel their leader can support them in improving, it speaks to an engaged team, which we would say at this point, at this table, probably a solid high contributor, like maybe not quite in exceeds, because it seems there are areas that the staff can identify that they're not getting quite the support they need. Growth, objective 3, kind of still links into number 1, that the company's growing quite well. Really, if I, as a sales manager, if I could see 30% growth year over year, I'd be a very happy man. And then when it comes to developmental goal, the last part, we would say a solid contributor again. If the staff can identify that she's consistently late and these kinds of things, we would want to know, has anybody ever really discussed this with her? Because we don't feel it's fair if someone just said, well, you're late all the time, so this is holding you back. Well, if no one's ever told her that, it's not really fair to judge her on that, but it's still very important to make sure she's aware of that. Developmentally, also with the staff, it was something that we kind of brought up right at the end, but if she's being given an overall exceeds expectations rating, but the majority of her team is, solid contributor and may not be getting a merit increase as an employee, our company's growing 30%, our boss says they really like us, they're saying keep up the great work, what do we have to do to get a bonus? Like, can't have differentiating opinions in that sense. So we overall, I think, came to the conclusion of probably an exceeds, but there is definitely room to improve, and this is the opportunity to discuss it.
So this group brought up a good point, I think, with just open communication. They talked about when Jane was late, was that ever addressed? And was that why she was getting marked a little bit lower by her supervisor? So good job, guys. Go to this table. Can we have a rep to talk to the group? Yeah.
So we kind of took a different approach because we started working through this. And then we're like, well, what does she want? What are her career goals? Because she's got this sales path and then she's got this management path. And so salespeople are competitive by nature. So did she go after the supervisor role just because it was different and new and a new challenge? Maybe she's not cut out for it. So really, before spending a ton of time on working to develop her as a manager, taking her aside and saying, okay, what are your career goals? Do you want this management job, or are you missing it enough? The fact that she's late every day, that's kind of a sales, kind of all over the place, unscheduled, kind of different path. And so maybe the management isn't her natural, and maybe she's not wanting to go, but feels like she's being pushed in that because that's what, is it Rita, the boss? Yeah. So then we thought, well, that's what we would do first. We would pull her aside, take her, have an initial meeting maybe, and say, like, long-term, what are your goals? And then from that, then, take it from there. Did I miss anything? Yeah.
Yeah, a good unique approach there. They took the coaching method first before they actually rated Jane's performance. I think they just wanted to see coaching wise what they can do to help. Is this how she sees her career progressing? Is this where she wants to be? So good job, guys. What about the last table? Short straw.
Yeah, and the nice thing about going last, I think, is everything has been said before we. So I think just collectively, I kind of speaking for the group without us putting a whole lot into that end, but we figured a solid contributor. Yeah, and the same sort of things. Like there's some information that we don't have. Some of the questions that we would want to, that I think that would need to be answered, would be. What does Jane's reports really think of her? Where they think that she's a solid supervisor, can be overbearing at times, but they do meet their objectives. So the same 3 reports that had problems with her being overbearing are the ones that asked for additional training. So looking for more information on that. Is that something that she didn't provide, or was it provided and they didn't see it as training? But overall, we had down that she was a solid contributor. And
thank you. All right, thanks everyone. So that's kind of the end of the presentation and the end of the case study. There weren't a lot of questions during the presentation, but if you have any now, I'm happy to answer them. Good job on the case study. It was a lot. Yep, question? I'll come with you with the mic.
I guess my question is on the 360-degree feedback. I've seen it kind of crash and burn in 2 other companies, so I don't know if anybody's had any success with that, but I haven't seen any at all. It actually, I wouldn't say destroyed the company, but it actually made some people very, very mad. So anyways, I don't know if you've got any experience with that.
Yeah, so I currently use a 360-degree feedback. I just don't want to stand in anyone's way in my organization, and I have kind of the opposite effect. I think that the employees that we're hiring now like getting feedback from various people that they interact with, and so I think it maybe depends on how you're obtaining that information. I mean, obviously, anything I obtain is confidential. I do also have a separate evaluation for supervisors, for peers, and for trainers, so they don't have to. They don't mark that an individual in the same way. They don't assess them in the same way. So that would kind of be my advice, but I'm not sure what your experience is.
It was something that was already implemented in the company before I got there, but I saw the fallout from it and had to deal with it and change some things up. But in the end, I had one company that just wouldn't even do performance appraisals on half the employees or all the employees in the office side, and it was like, come on, we got to get over this. But anyways, but because of it, everybody was looking over their shoulder and who said what. And sometimes you can figure it out. And it depends on who's delivering the message to the employee as well. So if they slip up or they say something out of context or character or whatever, then they can nail it down. So anyways, that was my take on it.
Yeah, and to touch on that, kind of who's delivering the feedback. When and I can only speak to my experience. So when we do our performance reviews at North & Company, it's myself and then a direct supervisor. It's mostly a lawyer in the room. The lawyer comments on the comments that they have made or other lawyers have made, and I'm kind of the rep for everyone else. So I would be letting them know, you know, this is the experience that your peers have had with you, and then the lawyer would be letting them know more, I would say, performance-based feedback, so that might be different too. We also communicate to our staff every time we do a review that this is your chance to fairly assess your peers, but they're also assessing you, right? So it's two-way and letting them know the benefit of it. And I think I mentioned in the presentation, it's used for sort of gap identification. It's not a good, bad, who likes who doesn't. So it's used to determine, you know, if the manager or direct supervisor is assessing them a certain way and their peers are assessing them a certain way, there's obviously a gap there. So it's not necessarily pass-fail. It's to determine a gap. And so I think, yeah, it depends on how the message is being communicated, but also communicating why it's important to the organization. I think that's something too. Any other questions? All right, thank you, everyone. I think we're going to have a little break today.